Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1 GV Whiskey 1 Good Vibrations. In my most recent video, I described my first 2-meter radio, and I also mentioned that novices were limited to crystal control, 75 watts maximum plate power input, and very narrow slices of the 80, well, I didn't mention the specific bands, but the 80, 40, and 15 meter HF bands, and about half of the 2 meter VHF band. Voice communications was allowed on 2 meters, but it was all CW on the other bands. The CW subbands in those days comprised much larger portions of the HF bands as currently allocated today, way disproportionate to the bandwidth required by a CW signal as opposed to the bandwidth required by a voice signal. And when voice was primarily AM, it was even more disproportionate. That to some extent has been corrected. It's a much different scenario nowadays, a much different frequency scape or electromagnetic wave scape today than it was then. But I mentioned that novices had to use crystals to control their transmitting frequency. And by crystals, I mean narrow slices of quartz, very thin slices of quartz. Quartz crystals provide a very predictable frequency. They're very thin, and 2 metal plates, one on either side, provide the excitation for the crystal and also the output, the electrical output from the signal. But the crystal itself, quartz, actually vibrates in an acoustic fashion. Acoustic waves travel through the crystal, even at frequencies as high as, well, it's rare to find a crystal that has a fundamental frequency much higher than 10 megahertz, but because it would just be too thin. It's a thin slice of quartz, generally about a centimeter square, between metal plates, pressed together, and then connected to 2 pins on the outside. Today's crystals are much smaller than the crystals of my time, and they also are hermetically sealed. But some of the crystals in my era, in the 1960s when I was first licensed, actually were assembled and screwed together so that you could open them up. And once in a while, a crystal would develop trouble starting. It would be kind of like starting a recalcitrant motor vehicle in the cold weather. It wouldn't always work, and sometimes they just stopped working because they got dirty inside. Some sort of grains of particulate matter got in the way between the plates and the crystal material itself. So you could open them up with a small Phillips screwdriver and take them apart. And with clean hands, and I mean sterile hands, like a surgeon's hands, in a sterile environment, clean those things off with a substance called carbon tetrachloride, a liquid, volatile liquid. I'm not even sure that it's legal to buy that stuff today without. It was awful. It was sort of like denatured alcohol, but you could clean them off with a very fine rag devised especially for that purpose, sterile, devoid of dust particles. You'd want to do this in a dust-free environment, and then you put the thing back together again very carefully, screw the screws back in, plug the crystal back into the radio, and hope for the best. And I remember cleaning a few crystals and actually having results. Actually I got crystals that were recalcitrant to work, to start up again and oscillate. It was a weird thing. We called them rocks sometimes too, so that if you had to use crystal control to determine your transmitting frequency, you said you were rock bound. And so it was. 7,185 kilocycles was my first operating frequency in the novice subband of 40 meters. It was, nowadays, I think that's part of the voice subband in 40 meters. They've expanded the voice band, and I think now novices are 7,100 to 7,150 kilohertz. I'm not certain, though, of the subbands these days. Novices are granted different privileges than they were. You can renew the license. A 1-year non-renewable license was the only way to go back then. If you didn't renew after 1 year, you were out. It encouraged you to upgrade to the general class license, which at that time conveyed all amateur privileges. There was no such thing as advanced class anymore. It had been discontinued. It's been reinstated since. And the extra class license, which also conveyed no additional privileges. It simply gave you more status, I guess, as a ham radio operator or something. Much different radioscape today than we have now. But when you were rock bound and your rocks didn't always want to start working, you could clean those rocks, some of them, literally, physically clean them with a volatile, toxic chemical and get back on the air and hope for the best. That's the way it was some 60 years ago now, 50 years ago, 53 years ago today, and even longer. Back then, it had only been 20 years since we'd been fighting the Germans and the Japanese in the Second World War. The Soviet Union was our arch enemy, ruled by Nikita Khrushchev for much of the time that I was a child. The Cuban Missile Crisis and all of those things, John F. Kennedy, the crazy 60s, all of that. I was really a product of the 70s in my high school years and college years. In the 70s, I don't know. You can read about them. It seems like nowadays it's a little bit like the 70s. Kind of restless. People aren't really satisfied with what they've got, and they don't really know what they would make them satisfied. But a well-cleaned, functional rock, if you were rock-bound, was a start. Stan Gibilisco, W1GV, saying 73, and so long, which, in my native fist, rock-bound or not, always has, it does now, and shall ever translate to da-da-da-da-da-da.